Want to turn your organization's data into a strategic asset? Pragmatic Institute offers training to data and business teams with a practical, hands-on approach. Discover how Pragmatic can help you build a culture of data-driven decision-making at pragmaticinstitute.com/data. Welcome to Data Chats, a podcast by Pragmatic Institute and the Data Incubator, where we tackle data topics and trends with experts, industry leaders, instructors, and alumni. I'm your host, Chris Richardson, and today I am sitting down with John Schwabish, founder of the data visualization and presentation skills firm PolicyViz, and a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. John is a leader in the data visualization field and advocate for clarity and accessibility in research. He has written 3 books on more effective ways to communicate data and has just released a new book, Data Visualization in Excel, this year. John, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Good to chat with you.
Yeah, I'm excited to dig into some of your experience and some of your insights, but maybe just before we get into any of that, you can say a little bit more about the work that you're doing now and kind of your trajectory, what got you there.
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I run PolicyViz, which is the smallest kind of consulting firm you can run because it's just me. But I also work at the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit research institution based in DC. I'm trained as an economist, so I have a PhD in economics. So I spend half of my time at Urban doing research. Most of my research is on issues around nutrition policy and policies that affect people with disabilities. I started my professional career in New York. I worked for a nonprofit for a few years, and then I moved to DC 2005 now, so it's been a while. I came down to DC and worked at the Congressional Budget Office for about a decade. So I worked there. For folks who don't know, CBO is the budget arm of the U.S. Congress. So whenever a member of Congress says, we want to pass this bill, how much is it going to cost? CBO is the one that's responsible for saying it's going to cost $1 billion or whatever the number is. So I worked there for a while and then got interested in this idea of doing a better job of communicating data. And it kind of took off from there with started doing some writing, a lot of speaking, and then got into the teaching world, both from some universities, particularly around here in the DC area at Georgetown and American and George Washington University. And then obviously with private clients and lots of other groups. So, and today I spend about half and half, but, probably more like 70% of my time doing data visualization and presentation skills, training and consulting and helping and talking. And then the other, third to, half of my time doing research.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm wondering if we could dig into that a little bit about what motivated you. What issues did you see that that made you eventually create this firm and do this kind of work? I'm curious, like what potential problems, or maybe you saw places where you could help. But what were you seeing, and then how did you fill in that gap, or how did you come to offer these services?
Right. So I'd say this kind of started around 2010, 11, 12. For those of you who remember, this was during the Obama administration. There was a lot of tension in DC, as there is now. So it's like we're kind of like repeating history. But what was happening around 2012, 2013 is there was a lot of debate about federal debt. And one of the things that was becoming pretty clear to me as an analyst at CBO was that we were putting out a lot of documents and reports and testimony in front of Congress about the implications of the different decisions that Congress was making or planning to make in terms of taxes, in terms of spending, and in terms of revenues and all these different things. And it just seemed to me as an analyst, as an everyday analyst reading the news and being at CBO, that our work wasn't being used as much or as frequently as lots of other groups out there in the world, including the research places like Urban, like the Brookings Institution, AEI, Heritage, all these different, groups around the country that work on these different issues. And it sort of felt to me like we could be doing a better job of helping our target audience, which is CBO's audience is members of Congress and their staffs, of course, but that's
Mm-hmm.
who they're focusing on. And I just felt like we weren't doing a very good job. And it kind of, as I thought about it and sort of just examined, again, from afar, I didn't have any like insider knowledge here, but just seeing that members of Congress are very busy. And
Mm-hmm.
we are, as human beings, visual creatures, and they are visual creatures, right? And so how could we create documents and reports that were more visual and that were easier for people to read and explore? And so I kind of stumbled in this world of the field of data visualization. It never occurred to me that there would be a field of people, of researchers particularly, doing research on how we perceive visual content. Like, how do we read a pie chart? Like, are we better at reading this chart or another chart? You know, these are the sorts of questions that folks were wrestling with. And so I started diving a little bit deeper. I started reading books. I started thinking about design more. I actually took a design class, sort of understand some of these tools. And it just became clear that the more, not just more visual, but just clearer visuals, that they're just clearer and easier to read and more direct, we were going to do a better job of communicating that information. And so one of the things that folks should know about the data visualization field, kind of writ large, at least within the social media world, is that it's a very friendly, open area because everybody comes to the field from a different place. There's people coming from design, from economics, from astronomy, from physics, from chemistry, from sports, from all over. And so everybody brings those different perspectives. And it was really easy to just sort of get involved in that field and start to learn and tap into other people's knowledge. And as I started to help create more, and I would argue better visuals, we could see an impact. We could see that the work was being used. And we weren't doing anything. I want to make sure, and I know we're going to come back to this, Chris, but I just want to make sure that like people know, like, you don't have to be a Python programmer or a JavaScript programmer or have an MFA in design or a PhD in statistics to make graphs that are impactful and that people can actually read. Like you just mentioned, right? I have a new book on data visualization in Excel. I use Excel a lot of the time. Like Excel is fine. It's not about the tool. It's about how you communicate your message or your story or your hypothesis. So I think that's the thing that I took to heart, is that we can all, and I as an analyst at CBO, can be a better communicator. And that's really what started it. And then just learning from other people. And then as I started to train and do workshops and, get requests for consulting, that's when I decided to start this side consulting gig, which I've been doing now since 2013. So it's been about 10 years now. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And so there are a few things I want to ask about that, but something that just stood out to me as I was listening to you is that you said it's not about creating more visuals, it's about creating clearer visuals. And that seems sort of obvious, but obviously if it was, people wouldn't need your services, among other things. So I wonder what are some examples, or maybe you could take me through maybe some advice that you've given where people were doing more visuals and you got them to do clearer visuals. Like, what does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll tell you one I had with a potential client yesterday. So this potential client has, and I say potential because I don't know yet, but had the scoping call yesterday. They have this sort of like cornerstone presentation file that they want to use. And ultimately what they want to do is be able to have this big deck that, a speaker could use for the hour talk, but also be able to pull chunks out of it, maybe for the 10-minute talk or the 20-minute talk, or even, embed this part because of this particular content and, maybe in a different deck where they're talking about their company's work and that sort of thing. And, we're talking about the challenges that they're having across a variety of dimensions, making the slides engaging, making the slides clearer with less text. And so we started walking through some of their examples. And for me, the first thing that I tell folks is that particularly the titles on slides, they should be short and they should be active. You should tell people what's going on, right? If you are out there giving a presentation or you're making a graph or you're writing a report or whatever it may be, and you are making an argument, that argument should be visible in the slide title or in the chart title. And again, you don't need to be an expert in this, right? Like this is the way I tell this story. So there's a very simple graph I use in trainings from the Pew Research Center, which is another research group here in DC. The graph has two lines. It's the labor force participation rate for men and women. Okay. And so the line for men starts kind of higher up on the graph, and it's going over time for about 50 years, and it's just trending downwards. And the line for women starts at the bottom, and over the same period is just trending upwards. So you sort of got this, kind of V, sideways V shape. And the title of the graph is the labor force participation rate for men is going down and for women is going up, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And I could tell you without a doubt, 99% of the economists or analysts that I work with, if I asked them to write a title for that graph, they would say labor force participation rate, comma, men and women, comma, 1953 to 2023, right? It's descriptive, but doesn't tell me what I'm supposed to learn from the graph. So the first thing I tell almost everyone I work with is make more active, concise titles. And I do get pushback on this. I'm sure you've seen this too. Like people say, oh, I can't make an active thing or a title because people think I'm being biased or I'm not being objective or something like that. Government analysts are especially keyed into that. But I tell you again, I mean, way more often than not, when you read these reports, the text in the report says in figure 1, you can see that this line is going up and this line is going down. And there's still this like breakdown between what's in the written word and then what's in the graph or in the slide. And so for me, the first, almost most obvious place that happens when I work with people is to say, let's tell people in the graph, in the slide, in the exhibit, in the whatever it is, what you want them to learn. What is the main argument? And sometimes you can't do that, right? Sometimes there's more than one thing you want people to pay attention to. Although I would say that's what subtitles are for. I would say sometimes that's what multiple graphs are for. Not everything needs to go in a single graph or in a single slide. So, I don't think any of this is really rocket science. It's just realizing that there is a better way, and that to recognize if you're the analyst or you're the researcher, you're the scientist, you've been working on this content for 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years, you're showing information to people that maybe they've never seen that information before, or maybe they've never seen it in the way that you are showing it. And so you need to hold their hand a little bit. And that doesn't mean it's dumbing down or it's a lay audience. It's just thinking, it's just putting yourself in their shoes, right? In their perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I wonder, I mean, some of my experience working with people in data science is that they'll, if we continue with that example, right, they'll show that sideways V, but they'll have a number of, caveats that make sense to say, like, we're only counting this form of labor, so keep that in mind. And we're only doing this, so keep that in mind. And these are how we've defined things, and there are outliers. And all of that makes sense. But I wonder if you have advice when it comes to displaying that or talking about that, because in my experience, and probably in most people's, the data scientist will have a bunch of additional information that is important, but may not necessarily be important for the audience. I wonder how you negotiate that or how you think about that.
Yeah. Again, another great question. I would just say for most of us that detail and subtlety and nuance, like, nobody cares, right? Like,
but data scientists care.
Yeah, I mean, nobody cares about the structure of your error term and your regression. Like, a lot of that comes with trust between you or your organization and the audience, right? So if my reader, my audience trusts me or trusts my organization, then if I'm putting that graph on Twitter or on a blog, I don't need to have all those data or all those details, right? Now, there's always going to be something in the background. There's always a longer report, right? That graph on the blog, there's a link all the way back to that long PDF report, and that's going to have all the detail. And so I, again, just think, like, what are the most important pieces of information? Like, what is going to help? So maybe you do need to say, for this chart, we use this particular inflation rate, right, adjuster. We didn't use this one, we use the city average because of X, Y, and Z. So it's not to say there should be no detail, but it's just to pick out what are the most important details, because they're footnotes for a reason, right? Like, not everybody reads those footnotes. Not everybody needs those footnotes. So what are the most important pieces of information? What is the core of the idea of the message you want to convey?
Mhm.
with whatever your visual content is and focus on that. And then think about how you might get someone from the tweet to the blog post to the brief to the full paper, right? Like things, they don't have to exist on their own. And for that interested reader who wants to make sure that you did use this type of inflation adjustment or you did do this sort of standard error clustering, right? They can go back to the full paper and they can get that. But on Twitter, it's a single image, it's a single bar chart. Maybe that's not absolutely necessary to include there because it's just distracting from what you want to say, which is, hey, this bar is bigger than this other bar, or this line is going up and this line is going down.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I wonder, have you noticed in the time that you've been doing this and working in this area, any changes beyond the obvious sort of technologies that exist or software that may exist? But when you're designing, if you were designing something for people 10 years ago versus today, is there a difference in sort of audience expectation and nuance or in the ways that people expect to see information?
Yeah, I think the big change has been, in particular for data visualization, I think the big change has been our use of interactive graphics. Mm-hmm. So I would say about 10, maybe 12 years ago, most stuff, and this is anecdotal. I don't really have data based on this. It's just experience. So I'm sure someone's going to be like, well, where are the numbers behind what he's about to talk about? I don't have them. Just my experience, just looking at this stuff all the time. But I'd say 10, 12 years ago, most graphs, right, in your major news media organizations were static graphs. So it's a static bar chart. Then we started to see tools like JavaScript, particularly the D3 package was released. We started to see R Shiny start to grow. We started to see Jupyter Notebooks start to come out. So we started to see all of these tools and platforms and technologies that made it easier for people to build interactive graphics. And so you saw this huge spike in interactive graphics. Now, the question, of course, is, do interactive graphics do anything? Well, I would say at this time, this is around maybe 10 years ago, we're now in this world where every single bar chart and every single line chart you could click on, you could hover, you could get these tooltips. And I think what happened was we learned fairly quickly that people don't do that. Like they don't click on the bars to see the number pop up because A, people don't have time to do that. They're not that interested. They just want to know that this bar on the left is way taller than that bar down there on the right. And secondly, we just saw the huge growth in people using their phones for interacting with content. I know about you, Chris, but like I'm not exploring a dashboard like on my phone. Like I'm not filtering and clicking and doing all that. I'm swiping and I'm scrolling. That's all I'm doing. And so I think what happened was we realized that interactivity wasn't really helping our readers. It was harder to create. It took more time and thus more money. And so then I'd say about 5-6 years ago, we started to see this real big pullback from that. And now I think what you see is interactive visualizations on the web are for those projects where the interactivity really helps the user and it encourages the user to explore or to filter or to do something kind of spectacular, as opposed to just, see the number for all the points along that line chart. Because what are you going to do with that that possibility? You're going to write down all those numbers? Like, no, you're not going to do that. So that for me, I think that's the biggest thing that I've seen is a sort of evolution towards and then away from interactivity. And now I think there's just a recognition that not everything needs to be interactive. And when we make things interactive, we should be purposeful and we should be strategic and be thoughtful about it because we want people to do something important through that interactivity, as opposed to just saying, hey, yeah, you can click on this bar chart and, you can do something, but that something isn't really meaningful. So I think that for me, that's the biggest thing. And of course, the toolkits that people have used has grown dramatically, both on the data side and the visualization side and the design side. But for me, that's the biggest kind of overarching change that I've seen over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I hadn't necessarily thought of it like that, but now that you say it, I can definitely see in my own experience. I remember seeing things that you could click on more. Now I seem to see things that you can scroll through and that may go from, say, one graph to another, but it has some kind of more for it. It shows how they're connected. Yeah. And so I think there's more of an emphasis on story or narrative. I wonder if you have any advice or thoughts about that. So going going from one graph or chart to the next, are there changes in that respect that make things easier to understand or more accessible? So instead of making one chart that's interactive, going from one to another to create a sort of narrative, how have you seen that evolve?
Yeah, so we had kind of along the same time frame I just described, we had this evolution of what the field is kind of calling scrolly-telling. So it was like storytelling plus scrolling, right? We sort of saw this big evolution. And we still see that. I think there's been a bit of a pullback on that where people, again, are a little bit more thoughtful about like not everything needs to be a big scrolly thing where this graph morphs or animates into this other graph and then goes to this other graph. Whereas now I think you see more where you do scroll, but it's like, here's graph 1, here's graph 2, here's graph 3. And I think now it's a little bit more conscious and strategic about how people do what you just described, which is let's tell a story and let's make sure people can follow the dot in this scatter plot to the aggregation in this next bar chart. We want to let people follow that, as opposed to here's a scatter plot and now here's a summary bar chart where, making that animation is takes time and costs money to do well. And so I think there's just more of an acknowledgement that we should reserve the time and the effort for the projects and the data and the stories that are going to have a bigger impact, that are going to mean more to people than, here's yet another story on this month's unemployment rate, right? We don't need to necessarily have all this fancy animation because people just want to know, did we add more jobs this month? Is the unemployment rate down this month?
Yeah.
How did it vary across the country? There's like, a half a dozen things. You just want to know. The animation, the morphing, the movement, the interactivity doesn't matter as much when you just want to know like a half a dozen facts.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You're also, I know, interested in accessibility, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about that and how that works in relation to what we just talked about, or just more generally with data viz. How should people think about accessibility in different ways, and what has changed over time with accessibility?
Yeah, great, important question. Yeah, I do have a report that I put out with some colleagues at Urban in December on this. I mean, it's a challenge, I think, for a number of reasons. Mostly, the tools haven't been particularly helpful. People obviously not recognizing that there's a need to think about people who have different types of disabilities and impairments. I think there's also an overemphasis on color vision deficiencies, commonly known as color blindness. I think everybody gets up in arms about reds and greens, but there are lots of other impairments. People who can't use a mouse, for example, to work their way through a website. I would also say like not all disabilities are permanent disabilities. If I break my arm this afternoon, I'm not going to be able to use my mouse in the same way, right? Now that's temporary, but for the few months where I have a broken arm, I'm going to have to figure out a different solution. I would also say like broadband access is an accessibility issue, right? We were just talking about animation and data. You have a big website that needs a lot of bandwidth. If you live in a rural part of the United States, and of course many other places around the world, but if you live in a rural part of the United States, you might not be able to use that website because you're working on a mobile phone where you don't have good internet access. So having said all that, the way that I think about making visualizations or making any kind of visual product or any product online accessible is to try to create a product or a platform that gives the same experience to people who have disabilities and for those who do not have disabilities. So the issue is, for example, you don't necessarily need to describe in excruciating detail for someone who's using a screen reader, which let me just pause there real quick. So for folks who don't know, if you are blind or have another vision impairment where you can't read, say, a website, you can use a tool called a screen reader. There's lots of them out there, and anyone can test them and use them. And the screen reader literally reads the text on the website or on your computer. And so what we might do to make visual content more accessible is to add alternative text to our images or our graphs on that website. So if anyone listening has used PowerPoint before and you drop an image into PowerPoint now, it prompts you to add alternative text or alt text. And so what that does is when the screen reader gets to the image, it actually reads that alternative text to the user. And when you think about writing that alternative text, you don't necessarily for every graph need to describe each piece of the graph. There's a vertical axis that starts at 0, and then there's a 10% tick mark and a 20% and a 30%, right? You don't need to say all of that. The idea, the core kind of philosophy is let's make the experience the same for sighted users versus non-sighted users. So instead, I might say, this is a bar chart showing the unemployment rate for 5 different groups, describe what those 5 different, name those 5 different groups, and the numbers range from 10% to 50%, or, whatever it is. So accessibility is really important, obviously. And I think it is getting easier and easier in many of the tools that are out there. There's a great tool that I would recommend called Chartability, which will enable you to sort of go through a checklist, as it were, to test your visualization, specifically visualizations for accessibility. But it is a challenge, and it is worth considering because about a quarter of the world's population has some form of a disability. And there's a lot of people that could potentially be using your content and reading your material that we need to be thinking about. And there's a lot of considerations here, and I think there's growth and evolution going on in this space particularly. But it is something that we can all, I think, be better at. And I'll say one last thing here. Go back to the question you asked earlier, where I was talking about these active titles, these good, titles. That's a great way to do your alternative text, right? Like if you've written a really good title for your chart, you pretty much have your alt text. You're pretty much done, because then you could say bar chart showing blah, where that blah is your title, and you're pretty close to being done with the alt text. So, I'm trying to, it's not about doing extra work. It's about giving that same experience. And it's about thinking, how can I make my content clear for everybody who is going to be using it?
Unlock the full potential of your organization's data with business-driven data analysis. In this Pragmatic Institute course, you'll learn how to communicate better with stakeholders, provide concrete results based on the data available, and support business strategy. Find out more at pragmaticinstitute.com/data. Yeah, I'm thinking like when you are consulting or when you're talking to a group, and especially within an organization that may be more sort of conservative or risk averse, and so doesn't necessarily want to, may think that just doing the default chart is fine. Like, why are we bothering with all this extra visualization? I wonder, what are some of the things that you would say or the ways that you would walk people through it? Because I think you and I, and probably a lot of our listeners, are bought into this, that you want to work as hard as you can to make visualizations accurate, accessible, engaging. But there are a lot of people still who are not necessarily bought into that. And I think there's a tension there sometimes in saying, this is why we should spend an extra week where we could be doing something else,
right,
focused on these visualizations. So what are some of the things that you would say in those cases?
Yeah, I think for me, the best way to do that is to just demonstrate. So you demonstrate that there is a better way. You show someone, this is the weekly report that we submit to the manager every week, right? And it's 12 pages of tables, right? And we know that each manager goes to their page for their group and they look at the one number that they want to see. But they're missing potentially the important number on page 6 because their group is on page 8, but they're missing that number on page 6. So now we don't need to go out and build special dashboards and, use JavaScript and build all these fancy things. Maybe we just need to make that table, add a little more color to it, add some flags that highlight the outliers or turn it into a bar chart or something like that. And so the way that I always work with groups that have this risk averse, or I'm not sure, well, I guess it's risk averse is a way to think about it. I think a lot of it is cultural change, is how do you change an organization that's sort of like, we've always done this 8-page report every week for the last 15 years. That's how we do it. So what do you do? So my approach has always been, don't go from 0 to 60. Don't tear that report down and make it an interactive dashboard that now people have to log in. Start slowly. Instead of having 8 pages of black and white tables, add some color. Maybe you add some graphs within that report and you start to demonstrate that there is a better way. And again, you don't need to go to these graphs that, your manager or your colleagues have never seen before, even though they might be better, right? But you might just have to get there, right? Because you do have to sort of change this culture of, like you just said, this is the way we do it. This is the way we've always done it. And this is what we're used to. And we're not ready to make that change. So I like to sort of take it in increments and incremental steps, and just demonstrate to folks that, hey, if we tried this other way, we can do better. And then you see them side by side and you say, oh yeah, this table that just highlights the 5 cells that are the highest values in a blue color, right? Like that's all it has to be. I see those 5 cells right away, and those 5 other cells in red that are the bad things. Now I look at this 8 pages and I'm prompted, I'm primed to see those things. That's all you really need to do. It doesn't, again, it's not reinventing the wheel. It's not rocket science. It's just thinking about how can we make this task easier, and how can we make it clearer for people to pull out the stories or the conclusions or the observations that we really kind of want them to make.
Yeah, I wonder, do you see it, or do you see a place for making an aesthetic argument? And what I mean by that is, I think sometimes the people that definitely, want to continue doing things as it's always been done, are very much into the function. And so thinking, I want to know the number. Does this tell me the number? Yes. And I think they would, some of these people would see any aesthetics or any changes meant to make it look more visually appealing to be just fluff or extra. I wonder if there is an argument for that, or do you tend to focus on the function of it?
Well, I think the design is, or at least can be, the function, right? So let's just take the table example we were just talking about. So if I take that table and I add an icon to the top right of every page, like I would agree with you that that's like fluff. That's not like necessarily helping. Just because I threw an icon on it, or I didn't use Arial font and I used some other font, maybe that's not particularly useful. But if I highlighted those cells in different colors, that might be useful. And again, here's where the kind of core design issue comes up, right? Like, am I going to use a fluorescent green to highlight those, or am I going to use like our branded color blue, right? Like, I mean, those are the sorts of things, because I am no designer, right? So I don't pretend to be a designer. I'm sure designers could do amazing stuff with the things that I've produced, but I just think about my target audience. I mean, when I think about making, for example, go back to slides, when I make a slide deck for an academic economics conference, like, I'm sure a designer could do amazing things with my slides. But like, when I'm standing in front of 20 or 30 or 50 economists, like, what I do is perfectly fine, right? Like, I don't need to like over design the thing, because I'm thinking about that particular audience. So yeah, I mean, I think there's design to engage. I think there's design to make things pop. And sometimes engagement is a goal, but I think oftentimes, particularly when we're thinking about data and data visualization, design is more functional, or at least it should be more functional, as opposed to, let's just, add some, ornaments right around this to sort of like make it look cool. Like, we used to throw clip art on everything back in the day, right? Like, we don't need to do that. And so I do see that a lot. The new clip art are those like CGI guys with like the no face, and they're shaking hands all the time. Like, I see those pop up on slides. Like, why is this weird red little CGI guy like on the slide? It's not useful. It doesn't help. So how can we create design aspects to our slide or our graph or whatever that actually help people get to the information? So that's where I tend to focus my attention.
Yeah, I wonder, do you have any examples of changes that you've seen, either, with your own experience or elsewhere, where a change in a graph or a change in a slide or presentation has led to significant change in terms of either how it's used or interpreted?
Yeah, this question of impact is such a hard one, right? Because it's like, I created a graph. Did it sway someone's thinking? Did it make a change? And can you isolate that effect, right? Oh, they saw this graph, but they didn't see anything else. So did that change their mind? Or is it because this graph was in this longer report within this news cycle that, made an impact? I mean, there are lots of great examples out there, I think, of graphs that I would say sort of anecdotally have had an impact, at least on people's thinking and inside and outside the field. There's a great piece from a data viz shop in Portland called Periscopic. This is after the Sandy Hook school shooting years ago. They created a data visualization that I think had a lot of impact just on people's perspectives around gun violence. There are projects like that I think have an impact on people's thinking. I can tell you when I was at CBO, just seeing some of the graphs being used in congressional hearings, like that is what we're trying to do. Now, I am no way fooling myself that an 8.5 by 11 infographic, infographic is going to, force Congress to make different decisions about spending and taxes. But you are providing information to people who can use it. So it's a great question. I don't think like I have a rule or guidelines for even like how you measure impact. And I think that's a sort of like, that might be like the thing that we're all searching for. But it's certainly a question, and it's something that we're striving for. But so I don't have a great answer to that, but I would say in terms of use, that's where I'm striving, right? Because if I can get someone to hold up that infographic in a congressional hearing, or it gets, from my thing and a version shows up in the Washington Post or the New York Times, I think for me, that's maybe as close as I can get to measuring impact, because I see it just going further and wider. And I think we've all seen these things that, sprout up on Reddit and they sort of take off, and you see these graphs, and some are, some because we're making fun of them, and some because they actually tell us something. Yeah. And I think that may be how we have to measure impact until we can figure out a better way.
Yeah, well, and that's a good starting point, at least, is how many people are viewing it, which usually even in an organization, right? You can see how many people have looked at your dashboard or whatever you're creating. So yeah, I think that alone can demonstrate a significant impact. But now that you bring up congressional presentations and things, I wanted to ask you about ethics. Obviously, I think nobody would say or encourage unethical presentations. But what are you thinking of, or what are some of the things that you would ask data viz people to think about when it comes to ethics and presenting data?
Yeah, I mean, it's so important, especially now in sort of our era of mist and disinformation. Yeah. I mean, there are a few things that, for me, the hair on the back of my neck stands up when I see certain things. So there are certain things that I look for. So, for me, the number one chart where I find people mislead or misinform, and sometimes it's not on purpose, right? Sometimes they're not doing it maliciously. It's just, it's just not done well, is on basically any dual axis chart, right? And what I mean by that is I've got two lines on a chart, and one line corresponds to this axis on the left, and the other line corresponds to this axis on the right. And that, to me, generally, because you can scale those two axes differently. The one on the left goes from 0 to 100, and the one on the right goes from 40 to 42. You can make things look different. You can make the patterns look different just by doing those scaling. And so that, for me, is the first most potentially egregious graph. Bar charts that don't start at 0 is another great example. Probably the only rule that like most data viz folks agree on is like your bar charts should start at 0, because and you can just test this. You're on your computer right now, maybe listening to this podcast, like create a chart, put in a bar that's 25, another bar that's 50, and start your chart at 0. And you'll see the one looks twice as big as the other. Now change where that 0 axis line starts. Maybe it starts at 24, right? Instead of 0. And you're going to see those bars are just going to look totally different. There's to overemphasize the difference. Yeah. And so I guess the common thread between those and many others that we don't need to go through is arbitrary decisions that the creator is making. Those are the things that make me stop. So, you've started your vertical axis for your bar chart at 24 rather than 0. Okay, that's an arbitrary decision. I mean, 0 is obviously arbitrary, but like there's a logic behind it. It's 0, right? 24 is an arbitrary decision. You've put these two lines on these two axes. They are different ranges, different starting and ending points. That's an arbitrary decision. Why did you do that? So for me, anytime someone's made that kind of arbitrary decision is a place where I just pause and I just take a little bit of a deeper look and say, why are they making this decision? Like, what is the adjustment here? So it is challenging. And I guess the other thing I would say, and there's a great book on this if folks want to read up more, by Alberto Cairo, who's a professor of journalism.
Podcast,
oh, great. You've had him. So like his book, How Charts Lie, is a great primer on this. And one of the messages in Alberto's book is just pause and just take a moment, and you don't need to share everything the second you see it, right? Like take a pause, take a beat, and, did you actually read the thing, or are you just sharing it because you want to like get it out there?
Yeah.
And once you read it, you believe it, and then you buy into it, then go and share it. But I think that's a really good sort of rule of thumb, is just take a beat. And for me, it's these arbitrary decisions that people are making where I hesitate to share because, sometimes it is often, I would say, well, I don't know about often, but sometimes it is misleading. And yeah, again, I might not know the motivation of the creator, whether it's malicious or not, but those are the things that I sort of look for.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And it actually reminds me of something you said earlier about the advice of saying what it is that the chart is demonstrating can be very good for a title. But I think we can also see that as being very biased if you start to say something like before we said, women are more prominent in the job market or in the economy or whatever we're looking at than they used to be 50 years ago. That seems like a good reading, like that makes sense. But you could see ways to make it seem like much more biased or unethical, like women are taking over the economy or something like that. Right. How do you think about making it a clear message so that you're not just simply saying economy chart number 1, male, female, or something like that, like you mentioned, but also not going overboard or not adding additional information that isn't appropriate or isn't necessarily ethical? How do you see that? Because I can see how people would hesitate to do any kind of judgment, quote unquote, because they're worried about looking biased, like you said.
Right. I mean, so I'll say two things on that. So one is, you as the creator of the chart or the slide, you are making an argument. So make your argument in the chart. But to your broader point, I mean, my daughter is 16. She's in high school. She's on the debate team. And, there'll be afternoons when she's at debate practice and she'll be texting me and she'll say, is this a reputable website? Is this a reputable website? Right. Like, but that's a part of it, right? Like they know that kids know Wikipedia is, you kind of take it with a grain of salt, right? And you have to be very careful unless you're going to dig through all the references. And so I think trust in organizations and agencies is a big part of it. So if you are putting out a graph and you work for, let's just pick a random news website. Let's say Breitbart, for example. Breitbart has a particular perspective on things. Anyone looking at a Breitbart graph should immediately take a pause and consider the source, right? And consider the perspectives and the potential biases of those sources, right? And, I could say the same thing for media organizations on the left, right? I'm just, right? So I think building trust with your audience is the way that you can start to expand. I'm not sure expand is the right word, but expand. I'll use that. Expand how you describe and how you tell people your argument in your graphs, because now you come to this graph from the blah blah blah, from the Chris or the Chris Richardson organization. It's like, oh, okay, so I know who Chris is, I trust his stuff, and I don't need to hesitate every time I see something come out of his group, as opposed to this other person over here. Every time they put something out, it turns out to be debunked. I need to take that more skeptically, and maybe not even use it at all. So, part of that, again, we get back to cultural change within and outside an organization, and to thinking about how you can build that relationship with your target audience.
Yeah. Are there ways that you've seen people build arguments that either are or aren't effective when they're showing charts? Like, I wonder, we've talked about the title. We've talked about some of the choices and, avoiding arbitrary choices, making clear what you're looking at. But I wonder if there's any other elements that we haven't talked about when people are either creating charts or presenting them to others that could make them more effective, or maybe that they have to watch out for because they might run down a wrong path.
Right. So we have kind of so far talked about the text outside the graph, right? Your title, your source notes, all the details. There's also the text that you can put inside the graph, right? So you have labels and you have layers of annotation. And I just like to think about the text that you put inside your graph in sort of three ways or three different classes. They're your kind of standard labels. So let's give an example for folks to think about here. Let's take a scatter plot. We'll do something real simple. We won't even name the variables. So you've got a scatter plot. There's 50 dots, one for each state, right? Okay, so now we've got our 50 dots. And most people, I think, listening to this podcast can picture that scatter plot. But I'm gonna make sure people aware. Not everybody can do that, right? Not everybody can picture a scatter plot. Not everybody knows what a scatter plot is. It's not like human beings are born with the gene that's like the scatter plot gene, right? Like not everybody knows that. But I'm guessing for most people in this listening here, they can picture that scatter plot. Okay, so three layers of annotation. One is we label some, maybe all of those dots with the name of the state. Probably not all because it's like too much text. But you label the states that's at the far top right, and the one that's at the far top left. You label those outliers. Okay, so that's what I would kind of call a label. Now we have two layers of annotation. Maybe we say next to that bubble up there in the top right, we say this bubble is Virginia because the variable on the x is high and the variable on the y-axis is big. And we label the state for the bubble for New York, and we say, New York's over here because of A, B, and C. That describes what's going on. That's a content annotation. And then I would say there's one more layer of annotation, which is maybe we help people who cannot picture that scatter plot. We help them understand how to read the graph. So let's say along our horizontal axis, we've been talking about unemployment rates. Let's just do that. We say the unemployment rate right in that middle there of that horizontal axis. And to the left of that, we put a little arrow pointing to the left and we say lower unemployment rate. And then on the other side, we have a little arrow pointing to the right and we say higher unemployment rate. And maybe we add a best fit line right in the middle there and we label that and we say, bubbles above this line are blah, 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 and bubbles below this line are blah, blah, blah. And that annotation layer helps people understand how to read the graph, right? As opposed to like what the content is. So for me, what I think about is, do I need that annotation layer, right? If I'm writing in a blog or on Twitter, I'll usually include that layer of annotation. But if I'm writing for an academic economics journal, I'm not going to do that. I mean, I can just assume that audience doesn't need it. And then do I need to add the content layer? And then do I need to add the label layer? And so I think the big thing that is kind of maybe the thread that runs through this conversation is how important I think text is in data visualization. We call it data visualization. It's a visual content, but we know we have evidence from research that people read titles. We suspect people read text. And so if they are reading text, that is part of it. And that is part of the messaging. And I'm sure you've heard this all the time too, Chris, like, oh, anybody should be able to, a good graph means that you can look at it and you don't even have to read it. You like it, right? It's like you get it right away. It's like, well, okay, here's a bar chart. I'm not going to give you any text. Tell me what the graph is about. Like, now it's just rectangles. Like that's literally all it is. It's just bubbles in a scatter plot. Like the text is there for a reason. And I think everybody needs to think carefully about how the visual, right, that bar or that bubble or that line and the text work together to kind of make that point or tell that story.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's funny because, people have moved to data viz because they want to go beyond writing a report that's all text. But then you do have to think about text. Absolutely. Yeah. And you make a good point of how that can go better or worse in a lot of these cases. But John, you've given a lot of good advice, and I always like to wrap up by asking you to suggest something that listeners could do to see a greater impact. And so some of our listeners may be creating these charts themselves. Other listeners may be asking for charts or asking for information from their data analysts. But for anyone listening to the conversation, I wonder if you could provide maybe two things that people could either try out or start doing that would have an impact when it comes to data viz.
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe I'll give one for each of those two groups that you just mentioned, right? So there's the creator, and then there's the person requesting the created, right? That's the manager and the analyst. We'll just make it easy. So On the manager side, I think you need to be gentle with people, right? You need to recognize that you don't just suddenly start to make great graphs and make totally new graphs and the problem is solved. It is a skill. Creating good, effective visual content is a skill. And so I think managers need to recognize that people want to do better. They want to communicate better, but to be gentle and to provide the feedback, the constructive feedback that will help people better understand what it is you want. To just say, I want this graph to pop doesn't help, right? Like, what do you mean by that, right? Do you mean you want better colors? Do you mean you want better titles? Do you mean you want a better font, a totally different graph type? Like you're tired of 40 bar charts, which all of those are reasonable. All of those are reasonable requests, but to give some more direction and constructive feedback. And then on the analyst side, on the creator side, I would say seek out collaborators. I get a lot of people in my classes and my workshops who think they're going to come in for 2 hours or 4 hours or a semester. And at the end, they're going to be an expert programmer and they're going to be a great designer and they're going to know how to code and all this stuff. And it's like, that's just not the world that we live in, right? You're not going to be that expert in all of these skill sets. And so consider collaborating with folks. Maybe I'll take a simple example. You have figured out that your graph type would look great as some other chart, but you don't know how to make that chart, right? It's not in your skill set. It's not in the tool that you use. Well, maybe you seek out other folks who can help you make that particular graph, or maybe you need to make something interactive that was static, but you don't want to have to learn how to use JavaScript or Tableau or any of these, other tools. Seek out collaborators, seek out people who have some experience in design and building color and, these things. I mean, I think that is kind of where the world is collaboration. And if you can find those collaborators together, you can sort of be that what I call the unicorn, right? You can have all those skill sets together. But as an individual, I just don't think it's a feasible goal to try to be that unicorn. I think it's better as teams. So for me, on the analyst side, the creator side, find collaborators, find teammates, find folks that you can work with and that can help you. And on the manager side, just be kind. I mean, we should all be kind, right? But just be kind to the folks that are trying and provide them with useful feedback rather than let's make it pop. Like tell them what you mean by that and fine tune it a little bit, and then be willing to have that iterative process so that you can end up in a better place.
Yeah. Well, I think that's great. And that could, it seems simple, but those can lead to some significant changes in a workplace for sure. John, you've given so much good advice and tips. If people want to follow you or learn more about you and your work, where should they check out?
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. They can follow me at policyviz.com is my main website where I blog and host my podcast and write about all things related to data viz and presentation skills. They can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Schwabish, which is my last name. Or they can find my research stuff at the Urban Institute, where we have a couple of blogs. We do have a blog that may be particularly attractive to listeners of this show, which is our Data at Urban blog, which is hosted on Medium. That is all the behind the scenes technical and innovative work that we're doing around data and research that folks might find useful. So just find me there and connect with me at any time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it.